we are thrilled to kick off this morning with a conversation with Ronnie Screwvala, Executive Chairman and co-founder of upGrad. Adam Freed, Managing Partner of GSV, will moderate this fireside chat to explore Ronnie's impactful journey in the online education sector as an Indian entrepreneur in education and entertainment. With that, please welcome Adam and Ronnie.
As they say, our clock starts now. So.
The clock starts now, that's right. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everyone. I am so excited to have this conversation. For those of you, if any of you have been living under a rock for the last 20 years, I'll explain to you a little bit about Ronnie Screwvala. You are the founder of UTV, which was one of India's first really big media companies in the cable industry, sold that to Disney. That wasn't enough, started a foundation called SWADES Foundation to bring transformation to rural villages in India, and founded then, because that wasn't enough, amongst other things, upGrad, which we obviously know very well in this sector. So it's a pleasure to get to know you, and really excited to have a conversation about your work and about India and what's going on here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that.
So my first question to you is you've been wildly successful with UTV. You were well known, and you thought, now I'll just jump in the education sector. That looks like an easy place to jump. What made you decide to found upGrad?
Well, I think I had some incredible co-founders, and I think each of them have their own story. And Mayank has been on one of the two of the forums here, so he would have talked about his part. But for me, I think what I learned in media was one of the things is storytelling. And I think at the core, education, learning, skilling, in a sense, there's a strong connect because you are compelling storytellers in whatever say. So to me, that segment was an inspiration. We had our not-for-profit foundation where we work with about 1,200 schools in rural India, and I have to say that was a kindling of the fact of the thought process. If I want to spend the next 15 years on building something in another sector, so I think those were the two penny-dropping moments for me.
What was when you say the penny-dropping moment? Was there a moment that you recall in a village or in the work with SWADES Foundation that you thought, yeah, education has to be the place that I focus energy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's not just in India. I think it was more, look, I think in many ways, the formal education is not going to get changed. We always have this picture of 100 years before and 100 years after, and we talk about almost all technology and education is still the bench in the school. And guess what? I think to a certain extent, it is going to remain. But the ability to disrupt the sector above it and to bring it was the more challenging one for me.
Amazing. So the global education sector is under some pressure, right? We've seen the public stocks in the sector have not been being rewarded for the kind of performance we were actually seeing in the underlying businesses. And then in India, obviously, we've seen a lot of controversy in the EdTech sector. Do you have any thoughts on, is this a moment of optimism, of concern? Any advice?
So I think the consumer can't be held ransom because we have investor issues. And I think we need to segregate the two. India, definitely from the job creation market, the skilling market, the education market, the learning market, the workforce development market to keep people job ready in India or Vietnam or in Asia or even in the US is intact. I think for the next 20 years, it's going to just grow and compound. I think media plus investors have actually made the dark cloud there. In the US, I think people are a little confused. I mean, you have a 2U that's actually a sales and marketing company. Right now, it doesn't even have a multiple. Check, which is a very well-run company, but again, I think they've got corrected because of the halo around AI and whatever else. But actually, I've been through 3 generations of that, where everyone thought broadband was going to change everything else, the next one. Today, now, suddenly AI is the mantra. 5 years back, crypto, and we know where that's landed. So I think it always gets blown out of proportion first by media and stock markets. I think for everybody here and anywhere else, the core sector and the consumption story and the level and need for what everyone is doing in this room is huge. It's humongous. And I don't think we should get distracted. And I think one rotten apple in the India does not put a dark cloud as far as that is concerned. That, I think, is a joint accountability of the founder and 51 investors who obviously felt that it was more important in a room and a board meeting to ask, when's your next secondary versus I don't see a CFO in the room. So for that one single aspect, I don't think we can hold the whole learning, skilling, education sector to ransom and put it in one paintbrush.
Well, I think one of the things that happens is in any sector is people look to stories. You mentioned story, and this has created a lot of story. And so people think, if you're on the investor side, I think, how do I make sure that I don't walk into a mess without understanding what's going on. And if you're a company builder and you're scaling your company quickly, how do I really know what's happening in my company? And you've now been an entrepreneur several times. Any advice or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you need to be an active board member. You need to be an active investor. You need to ask the right questions and not the wrong questions. And I think that's as simple as that. Why would anyone have shock and awe that after I put in $100 million or $400 million, I can't ask the right questions? You have to have the right for that. Because I think in those exact companies, if people had asked the questions they're now beginning to ask now, 4 years back, there wouldn't be anything. There'd be a very, very, very different story. It could have been a very different story in another way. It may not have raised the $4 billion that it needed to be raised, and actually been another story. So I don't think anyone here needs to introspect or reflect on this. I think they just need to do what they normally do, which is their fiduciary responsibility as an investor or a board member to ask the right questions and protect their investment.
The first time I came to India was in 1996, and it was an amazing and eye-opening experience, and it was a very different place. I mean, I remember coming to Gurgaon for the first time in 2003, and there's an explosion of activity here, and an optimism that I don't necessarily feel in other parts of the world, including, frankly, what's going on in the US. You know, to what do you attribute that, and where do you see that going and growing?
So I think we always put infrastructure first before the spirit of a country, and I think today, what's exciting here is genuinely, if you ask most people, and especially the younger people, they do believe that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. And I think if you ask some people in Europe, I'm not sure the same chant would be there. And the US would be mixed pre or post your elections this year. So I think that's a different cadre that would go across the board. But today, I think the spirit here is 10 times bigger than the fact that the look of Mumbai or the look of Delhi and the metro cities and the freeways and the highways have actually changed that. I think it's the spirit. There is raw ambition here. Don't forget, 100 years back, 150 years back, 25% of the world GDP was India. So actually, we're a nation which was actually had that raw DNA, maybe suppressed through colonization to a certain extent, and then some other economies taking over. And I think everyone's excited that this is our time. However, I do want to say, since the 1990s, we've always keep proclaiming this is our decade, and it's not worked. So I think we should do it with the right mix of caution. And I think today the government, the private sector, is channelizing it and it's best in a very complicated environment where 1.4 billion people with differing views is not easy to manage.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it turns out in the United States, 300 million people with different views is not easy to manage. When you think about the underlying energy of the country, which is I think what you're talking about, that there's a cultural DNA of energy and to some extent the desire for growth. There also, though, when you started UTV, weren't models of entrepreneurs who had been successful. I mean, now you get hit in the head with a blog without it being about some successful entrepreneur or would-be entrepreneur. How did you start to see entrepreneurship as a path, and how do you think that path has evolved over the years?
I think it's evolved well because what was otherwise something that looked as an option where if you didn't get a good job, you then became an entrepreneur. So it wasn't celebrated or felicitated. I think to that extent, the conversation has gone out of the drawing room and the family to actually going out and execute. I think the reverse is we need to be careful because normally that brings a very high sense of entitlement. And I think if I can reflect on my experience, I started at a time where you could not feel entitled. And I think today entrepreneurs do feel entitled. For them, raising funds seems to be the first stop. And I'm saying that should be number 5 on your list of anything you want to do. But that seems to be the number 1 goalpost. So when you start with entitlement, this sector, I think, is a sector which is very high on impact. It will be very high on value creation, but we've got to find the right mix. And for that, I don't think we need the money we need that everyone keeps talking about in this sector. And I think part of the rotten apples is because it was just too much money being thrown at something which actually, this sector needs change with frugality. And I don't mean frugality isn't just, it's frugality means it forces you to innovate well beyond. So if you want to disrupt this sector, you need innovation. If you need innovation, you actually need less money, and that's when the results will come in. So I think that would be my word of caution to an otherwise very high sunshine sector.
Can I push in on that? Because on the one hand, the advice I think rightly is, I remember Eric Schmidt said at Google when I was there in the early 2000s, I want to see every 2-person office should have 3 or 4 people in it. and I'm always going to constrain your hiring because I want you to feel the pressure of effectively that frugality, of don't get caught up in it. At the same time, if you're an entrepreneur, you need enough money to make sure that when there's a pitfall
But
in
what
the
is
market.
enough, I guess, is the
So
most
that is the
important.
question. How should an entrepreneur, I mean, if we get to the next level of specificity, what is the balance of frugality and enoughness?
That's why you're an entrepreneur. You've got to figure the balance out, because if you don't figure that balance out, and if you don't stay with that balance, and look, there's enough people out there that's either going to throw money at you in the beginning or be the fair weather friend and take it away from you. So it's your balance, because if you're looking at it based on the balance of, oh, now there's a winter and nobody's putting money in, well, guess what? We did not behave ourselves. I think that sense of entitlement today, I find, for example, unacceptable that investors actually feel that founders should be topped up with ESOP, for example. And then you get it's like you didn't manage your cap well, you raised a lot of money, now you're down to 5%, now you're going back to your investors and saying, top me up because I need to be motivated. And that, I think, just takes the accountability even down further. And then you have what you would call your non-cash ESOP write-offs in the P&L and balance sheet, which are not non-cash. Those are pretty real stuff. So I think for people in this sector, we need to be highly accountable for impact. And if with frugality and less money, we're going to push for innovation. And I think, look, at upGrad, we're equally guilty of lighting both. So I'm not sitting here talking from the pulpit, but I do know that it takes a lot to do that. But if we do, we don't need to worry about the perception of where the sector is headed and what's happening here, because there's enough opportunities out there.
You know, you mentioned that part of the original driver for you to get into this sector was an impact driver, and yet 10 minutes of the conversation has been about the money factor. How do you think about balancing a business which is a double bottom line business, where you have to do well and you have to do good, and you can't fail on either and feel good about yourself?
Well, actually, the report card is pretty clear. Everyone who spent money on marketing has got no ROI. Everyone who thinks that this is the high sales, the biggest drawback in this sector is the level of marketing. This is a sector for the last 100 years, nobody's actually promoted and marketed, right? It's a very subtle approach. It's more about building something and then gravitating to that. So I think the value of money that's been put into sales and marketing, that needs to change, because it is a pull factor. I do need to market make to create and make people realize how important upskilling yourself at every single calendar of your event is going to happen. That's not going to happen by me beating down the bush or sponsoring a cricket tournament or being a T-shirt owner at a sports league. I think it's going to happen with a lot more communication. Basically, we need to inspire learners and students to upskill themselves. And for that, the best way to do that is what my vocation in the past was, which was storytelling. Because if you can tell those stories, that's where the conversion is going to happen. Today, I think marketing is no longer about advertising, right? It's much more about peer-to-peer. And what I've learned in the last 5 years in this sector is that the power of peer-to-peer learning is most respected. Today, the world has absolutely changed. You want to learn less from professors and much more from peers. Less from professors and more from industry experts who've had that. So if you see that change that's happening around the world, that's where the sector is heading.
I'm thinking about the marketing piece and the difference between storytelling and you're really, I think, talking about the difference between brand marketing or you're talking about cricket matches, but you can't not market, right? So how does marketing mean, are you saying focus on product first and foremost, and then, and there's going to be the skeptical is going to say, like, you got 1.4 billion people in the country who could be your market. How do you not try to reach them?
But what is a brand? A brand is created over a period of time. It's not created by advertising. A brand is word of mouth. A brand is where you build credibility. A brand is when 1 million people have learned through you and are willing to pay you a premium price. A brand is when they want to come back 4 years later and learn from you. A brand is not because you put a name and said, see, I'm around. Because the chances are, at the money that you're burning, the chances are I'll look at it from the outside and say, I don't think you're going to be around for 10 years. Because you're spending so much money here and less on the outcomes. I don't think you're going to be around for 10 years, and then I'm set myself back. So the credibility, for example, on technology and online learning today is really about the fact is, are you going to be around? Where is that touch and feel? I think e-commerce went through that 20 years back around the world, and the credibility had to be built for using your credit card, being able to do something which is not touch and feel. And I think today the offline-online model, which is really the way to go for changing mindsets, it's just about starting. But the more we see outcomes, that to me is the brand and not necessarily advertising.
You've historically said in interviews that you think you learned more from your mistakes than your successes. Are there mistakes that you look back on your own career and think are instructive for this moment that we're living in today?
Yeah, tons of them. I think I've been very, very articulate about saying my failure rate is 8 failures for 2 successes. And I think my 2 successes have been larger and bigger because of my 8 failures. Because otherwise, if I had a ratio of 5 failures and 5 successes, I think everything would have been moderate. But therefore, I think, yes, I think even in the sector that we're in today, it's been a learning curve. I'll give you our segment in education in rural India, which was my first learning before I came into upGrad. And the biggest mistake I made as a not-for-profit was setting targets. Because when you're giving back and when you're in that sector, the community is your client and your customer. They have to build trust. They need to feel comfortable about you. So you saying, I want to go out there and change the world or build 40 schools or give them water or sanitation, but if they're not ready for it. Same way today, the consumer in this space we need to build trust. It needs to be done systematically. We need their peers to tell them how it's changed their lives versus us going at it in a very different manner.
You know, it's funny, we talk sometimes in this sector about exits, and I want to talk about it on 2 different levels. One of them is, this is a country that has a huge amount of activity going on in the sector and across the commerce sector, and not as many exits in the sense of IPOs yet or large acquisitions. And then you've talked about exits in the context of Swadesh Foundation as well, meaning like you go into a village and then you have to leave that village at some time. You're trying to set it up. And do you think about exits as being graduations? I mean, let's take the first one first. I mean, how do you think about exits in this market?
So exits is something that's plagued me. I think I've been labeled a serial entrepreneur, which almost sounds like a serial killer, is a little bit where you feel it's a premeditated move. You're not a serial entrepreneur. You're not a premeditated move that you're premeditatingly looking to exit. Actually, exits has to happen when it needs to happen. If you pre-plan them, they're not going to happen at all. So I think when I exited UTV to Disney in 2012 was a very bad word. Maybe 2015, 2016, it became aspirational. But everyone looked at me as having abandoned the sector and abandoned the company at that particular point in time. If I look at today, even exactly as you brought it in rural India, when we are now 7 years into our villages and we need to move out, we will have a little finger there. We will have a volunteer. We will have somebody there. But the whole context in the social space and giving back space, my learning was, if I'm doing something phenomenal for 20 years in 3 schools, there is no report card. But what am I doing for 20 years that didn't bring about permanent change enough for me to move out from there? So I think today, succession planning and even founders who then bring in CEOs, in a sense, that's an exit strategy. I think IPO is a liquidity event. It's never an exit strategy. I think we make it out to be too much of a halo there. It's always and only a liquidity event, sometimes forced, because you're at 5% and the 95% feel, I'm not going to give you any more money, so I have to list. And sometimes you feel it's the right stature now for the company to go to the next level. I'll be able to attract the best talent now because I have a liquid currency, and now I can look at it with a different sense of transparency and a currency that I need to do. So I think we need to look at the staggered approach rather than pre-planning and being obsessed with exits. Because the main point is, if you are looking to exit, you're going to get 1/3 the value. The best exits are when people approach you, not when you approach people.
So you've had this career of seeing opportunity, and we are in a moment of sea change right now. You know, you said the mantra of the day is AI, but it does seem to be really a revolutionary technology. Where do you see the sort of opportunity set? What is most exciting to you in this moment?
I think most of these are very strong catalysts, and I think AI is going to play a major role, but as a catalyst role. At the end of the day, technology hasn't changed consumers. It's a key question whether the consumer habits, you have to be at the core, has to be the consumer habit. If technology is leading it, I found it momentarily. But when the consumer as there's a need and technology is harnessing it, I found it to be more 10 years and 20 years off there. So I think it's a fine balance. AI is incredibly powerful. I think it's gone into the limelight in the last 1 year. But it's been around for 5 or 6 or 7 years, 8 years, in a subtle manner. I mean, you're driving a car, it's already equipped with AI. Now you just look at it in a very different manner than how you looked at it 5 years back. So it's been latent, it's got its moment in the sun, and that's where I believe sometimes if it's got too much of sunshine, it's going to have a fair sense of disappointment. Because firstly, when something is so radically advertised, the bad stuff comes out first. The good stuff you realize after 5 years. So I think some of the wrong stuff of what AI can do is going to come out first. Then people are going to be a little disillusioned, and then the good stuff comes out. And if you see that with innovation for the last 20 years, that cycle is oft repeated.
So you are famously great at giving advice. Any last nugget of advice for us in this moment, in this sector, as entrepreneurs and investors?
In this sector, I would against it say, I think you don't need that much money to really succeed in this sector. I think the more frugal we are in our approach, we're here to disrupt. We're not here to augment. This is not a sector where if you augment, you're going to create value. You have to disrupt. And for disruption, you need to be innovative and you need to be pushed with your back to the wall and not have the kind of support that everyone has there.
Got it. Thank you so much,
Thank
Ronnie.
you.
Really, really a pleasure.
Thank you.